My humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together. Desmond Tutu. Meditation provide the missing pieces to your dream. The editor.
Freedom's Journal was the first African-American owned and operated newspaper in the United States. A weekly four-column publication printed every Friday, Freedom's Journal was founded by free-born African-Americans John Russwurm and Samuel Cornish on March 16, 1827, in New York City, New York. The newspaper contained both foreign and domestic news, editorials, biographies, births and deaths in the local African-American community, and advertisements. Editorials deriding slavery, racial discrimination, and other injustices against African Americans were aimed at providing a counterweight to many of the white newspapers of the time period which openly supported slavery and racial bias. Freedom's Journal was not born solely out of the perceived need to defend African Americans as much as a desire within the black community to create a forum that would express their views and advocate for their causes. The California Eagle, Charlotta Bass, Los Angeles newspaper owner. In 1930, the California Eagle was the oldest and largest black newspaper in the state of California. In 1948 she supported Progressive Party candidate Henry Wallace in his failed bid for the presidency. 4 years later she was nominated for vice president on the Progressive Party ticket. She was the first African-American woman to carry a political party's nomination for the second highest office in the land. Her Bass's acceptance speech given at the Chicago convention of the Progressive Party on Sunday, March 30, 1952. His newspaper, the Cairo Gazette, 18A21889, was the first black daily in the Midwest and claimed to be the first in the nation. He moved to East St. Louis, Illinois, in 1901 and then to Springfield, Illinois, in 1905 where he remained until his death. Scott was owner, editor of the East St. Louis Leader, 1901, and the Springfield Leader, 1905. Seattle newspaper publisher Chris H. Bennett was born in Waynesboro, Georgia in 1943. Bennett then worked for the African-American newspaper The Facts before leaving to start Seattle Medium. 27-year-old Bennett founded Seattle Medium newspaper in 1970, locating it in an office above a dry cleaning shop. He promoted the Medium as a weekly African-American paper that focuses on community and local news in the Seattle area. Its masthead slogan reads, "A message for the people, by the people." Since beginning Seattle Medium, Bennett has involved himself in a number of community-building activities. Bennett also has been involved in African-American civil rights issues in other states. In 1987 Bennett protested Arizona Governor Evan Mechem's decision to eliminate the state's recognition of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday as a holiday. When the National Newspaper Publishers Association, NNPA, a predominantly African-American newspaper group, was scheduled to hold its annual conference in Phoenix, the organization, at Bennett's recommendation, decided to cancel the conference. The Messenger, an independent magazine, was founded by labor activist A. Philip Randolph and economist Chandler Owen in 1917 with the help of the Socialist Party. The Messenger alarmed both the white and black establishments by supporting socialism as well as the arrival of the new crowd Negro, black intellectuals and political leaders who challenged both reactionaries like Booker T. Washington and civil rights leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois. Among other things, the magazine opposed the United States' participation in World War I, and encouraged armed self-defense by blacks against white mobs and lynches. It was for these reasons that the magazine was initially termed radical by the United States government. In 1919, for example, the U.S. Justice Department claimed the Messenger was the most stable and the most dangerous of all the publications it investigated. Iowa, Wells began to write editorials in black newspapers that challenged Jim Crow laws in the South. She bought a share of a Memphis newspaper, the Free Speech and Headlight, and used it to further the cause of African American civil rights. After the lynching of 3 of her friends in 1892, Wells became one of the nation's most vocal anti-lynching activists. Fitzgerald Beaver was media entrepreneur in the Pacific Northwest. He was the founder and publisher of The Facts, one of the 2 major black newspapers in Seattle, Washington since the 1960s. Building on a long tradition of African American journalism and newspaper ownership dating back to the 1890s in Seattle, he became through his newspaper an influential voice in the city and the region. In 1961, Beaver moved to Seattle, Washington to manage radio station XAM FM, the first black-owned radio station in the Pacific Northwest. He stayed at the station only a few months before launching the Facts newspaper on September 7, 1961. The Facts quickly became a major media presence in Black Seattle. The paper's mission stated, "We try to pick up where the daily papers leave off," meaning the paper would focus on stories not covered by the major daily newspapers but which were of particular interest to black Seattleites. He gave the paper a distinctive pink color to separate it from its competitors. By the late 1960s, Beaver authored a popular column called Right On that discussed local and regional issues. Robert C. Maynard, the first African-American editor and owner of a major daily newspaper in the United States, the Oakland, California Tribune, was known as a trailblazing journalist who led efforts to desegregate newsrooms and educate minority students to pursue careers in journalism. The Oakland, California Tribune, which had been called the second worst newspaper in the United States. But Maynard quickly turned it around and purchased the paper in 1983, making him the first African American to own a major metropolitan newspaper. The Tribune subsequently won hundreds of awards, including a Pulitzer Prize in 1990 for its coverage of the Loma Prieta earthquake. Maynard also received dozens of awards, including 8 honorary doctorates and the Elijah Parrish Lovejoy Award, named for the abolitionist who was killed by a pro-slavery mob in Illinois in 1837. C.B. Powell, longtime owner of the Amsterdam News, was born in 1894 to former Virginia slaves. He received his medical degree in 1920 from Howard University School of Medicine and began his career specializing in X-ray technology. Powell was the first African-American X-ray specialist and owned a laboratory in Harlem. It was at his lab where he met Dr. Philip H. M. Savory, his future business partner. The 2 physicians collaborated to create the Powell-Savory Corporation in 1935. In 1935 they purchased the Amsterdam News, the largest newspaper in Harlem, for $5,000. Powell became publisher of the New York paper and retained that post until its sale in 1971. Powell studied other successful newspapers including the New York Times and patterned the Amsterdam News after them. He also made the Amsterdam News home for numerous African-American journalists such as Earl Brown, Thomas Watkins, James L. Hicks, and Jesse H. Walker. Powell expanded the paper's coverage to include national and international news. Vibe is an American music and entertainment magazine founded by producer Quincy Jones. The publication predominantly features R&B and hip-hop music artists, actors and other entertainers. Quincy Jones launched Vibe in 1993, in partnership with Time Incorporated. Originally, the publication had been called Volume before co-founding editor, Scott Powellson Bryant gave it the name Vibe. Western Appeal, the Appeal of St. Paul, Minnesota. The publisher John Quincy Adams is best known as the editor. Between 1886 and 1922. In 1880 Adams was responsible for convening the first colored National Press Convention and what was elected its first president, a position that he held for 2 years. Adams' newspaper in St. Paul became the center of political activism in the Upper Midwest, challenging the color line that continued in Minnesota after the Civil War. He partnered with Frederick L. McGee, a young African-American lawyer from Chicago who moved to St. Paul in 1889. The two were instrumental in initiating legal challenges to racial discrimination in Minnesota and in passing legislation guaranteeing civil rights. The Sentinel, Leon H. Washington, Jr., founding publisher of the Los Angeles-based African-American newspaper. Washington moved to Los Angeles, California in 1930 at the urging of his cousin, Loren Miller. Miller referred Washington to Charlotta Bass, the editor/owner of the California Eagle, then the oldest and largest black newspaper in the state. Washington accepted employment as an advertising salesman for the newspaper. After 3 years, Washington left his advertising position and started his first newspaper, which he originally called the East Side Shopper. This was a free circulation newspaper that catered to African American audiences, especially residents in the Central Avenue district. After a year, readership had increased, allowing Washington to change the name of the paper to the Sentinel and make it a subscription-based publication. The Sentinel soon became a rival to the California Eagle. The Final Call is a newspaper published in Chicago. It was founded in 1979 by Minister Louis Farrakhan and serves as the official newspaper of the Nation of Islam. The original newspaper of the Nation of Islam was called The Final Call to Islam and was published by Nation of Islam leader Messenger Elijah Muhammad in the 1930s. This small newspaper evolved into Muhammad Speaks in the 1960s and attracted a circulation of 900,000 per week, with monthly circulation of 2.5 million. Founded by Louis Farrakhan, The Final Call follows the traditions of the Muhammad Speaks newspaper with national and international news and coverage of political issues. It is the official communications organ of the Nation of Islam. Today, the weekly Final Call serves a readership of diverse economic and educational backgrounds and is distributed in North America, Canada, Europe, Africa and the Caribbean. The current editor-in-chief is Richard B. Muhammad, and the managing editor is Starla Muhammad. The Atlanta Daily World newspaper, William Alexander Scott II, the founder. Scott II began to publish the Atlanta Daily World on August 5, 1928. The Atlanta newspaper began as a weekly paper, gradually publishing on a bi-weekly basis by 1930. On March 13, 1932, the newspaper went into daily distribution, becoming the first African-American paper in the nation to achieve that status. With the closure of the Atlanta Independent the following year, the Daily World became the black community's sole newspaper. Using subscription agents to go door to door, he developed readership that eventually stretched beyond the Georgia capital. He also promoted the paper as a business venture rather than as a tool for politicians and thus was able to attract advertising from both black and white businesses including national companies such as Sears and Coca-Cola as well as prominent local businesses. In 1931, Scott developed the Chattanooga Tribune and the Memphis World, the first two of what would eventually become a chain of 50 newspapers. John Herman Henry Sengstacke, November 25, 1912, May 28, 1997, was an African-American newspaper publisher and owner of the largest chain of black newspapers in the country. Sengstacke was also a civil rights activist and worked for a strong black press, founding the National Newspaper Publishers Association in 1940, to unify and strengthen African-American-owned papers. The nephew of Robert Sengstacke Abbott, Sengstacke was his designated heir to take over his Chicago Defender, which he did after his uncle's death in 1940. Sengstacke also published the Michigan Courier in Detroit, the Tri-City Defender in Memphis, Tennessee, and acquired the Pittsburgh Courier in 1966, reopening it the next year as the New Pittsburgh Courier. Sengstacke worked with President Franklin D. Roosevelt to have African-American reporters admitted to presidential press conferences. He pressed for opportunities in the United States Postal Service for African Americans. One of Sengstacke's major political goals was to desegregate the armed forces. President Harry Truman supported this goal, naming Sengstacke to the commission he formed in 1948 to integrate the military. Ebony, a pictorial news magazine published by Chicago, Illinois-based Johnson Publishing Company, first appeared in November 1945. Created by John H. Johnson, who modeled his publication after Life magazine, Ebony celebrated African American life and culture by depicting the achievements of Black Americans. It honored Black identity by portraying Black life, refuting stereotypes, and inspiring readers to overcome racial and other barriers to success. John H. Johnson began his career with Negro Digest in 1942, and started Ebony 3 years later. Both magazines were so successful that in 1972 the Magazine Publishers Association selected Johnson Magazine Publisher of the Year. Negro Digest changed its name in 1970 to Black World but ultimately folded. Today Johnson Publishing also produces Jet Magazine. Negro Digest founded 1943, later Black World. During the most turbulent years of the civil rights movement, Negro Digest, Black World served as a critical vehicle for political thought for supporters of the movement. Black Enterprise, founded by Earl G. Graves. Black Enterprise is a monthly business magazine for African American professionals and entrepreneurs that provides essential business information including money and career management, investment strategies, advice for starting and growing a business, and business news and trends. Black Enterprise magazine's list of the nation's top 100 industrial and service businesses. I recall reading an issue of Black Enterprise on the college campus in 1978. I paid 35 cents for the issue. I became hooked on Black Enterprise from that day forward. I learned more about the business world than I did from the classroom. The Crisis magazine is the official magazine of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. It was founded in 1910 by W. E. B. Du Bois. Editor, Oswald Garrison Villard, J. Max Barber, Charles Edward Russell, Kelly Miller, W. S. Braithwaite, and Mary Dunlop McLean. The Crisis has been in continuous print since 1910, and it is the oldest Black publication in the world. Today, The Crisis is a quarterly journal of civil rights, history, politics and culture and seeks to educate and challenge its readers about issues that continue to plague African Americans and other communities of color,